Welcome to the League of Women Voters Friday discussion with Planning and Community Development Director, Cara Brewton. Today, she will discuss the process and the different departments and committees that have oversight and regulation responsibilities for development in Brookline. Article 14 is a proposed bylaw change intended to bring good construction oversight practices and community communication requirements to large private construction projects seeking special permits. Article 16 is a requirement for at least a 15-foot deep non-residential space at the ground level of multi-unit residential development in certain locations that permits commercial operations there. And just for the record, the one in between, that we're doing 14 and 16. 15, we would have taken up at a different time. It is a proposal for an overlay district along Boylston Street, but the petitioners have withdrawn it and plan to do some, let's say, address some issues and resubmit Article 15 in the fall. So that one will not be considered at this town meeting. Anyway, that's my sort of brief overview, and I now look forward to hearing in much helpful and interesting explanation for Articles 14 and 16 from Cara. Cara, your floor.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, and good morning to everybody. As Betsy said, my name is Cara Brewton, and I've been with the town of Brookline since 2008. And it certainly is my home. I spend many waking hours and sleeping hours in Brookline, and I absolutely love this community to work in. I do not have any slides to share for Articles 14 and 16 because I think they are fairly straightforward, but I think it is a good conversation for the League of Women Voters to highlight, as it's a helpful instrument in talking about the development process and learning about how that works generally. So as Betsy said, Article 14 deals with special permit conditions. So just kind of give everybody a bird's eye view here. There are many things that you can do without going to the Planning Board or Board of Appeals. Many times you can go to the building department and get a building permit, sometimes even within an hour. So that's, kind of one end of the spectrum of permitting in Brookline. Sometimes the building department will say, this sounds nice, but it requires what's called a special permit, which means it's a conditional permit. The granting authority does not have to issue the permit. And there are usually a bunch of rules and regulations that help them make that decision about whether to grant that permit. So special permits that come into the town of Brookline request, the most frequent ones are things like someone wants to expand their porch or build out a second floor bedroom over an existing garage. That's absolutely the most kind of special permit that the town processes every day. And usually those special permits are triggered for things like a homeowner wants to do a small addition, but it encroaches into a setback, meaning a distance from usually a side or rear lot line. There are standards in our zoning that say what distance that must be. And throughout Brookline, our existing homes already very, very often already encroach those standards. But if you build on or do an extension, you have to get a special permit approval in order to increase building. There's lots of caveats to that, but that's kind of big picture what's going on. So we have had larger projects. In case you haven't noticed, we have had many large projects in recent years, and that's a variety of types. But most of what people probably experience have been permitted through a state permitting process called 40B or comprehensive permitting. Those projects, for the most part, can set aside or get waivers from much of what's in our local zoning. And the reason is, the state policy reason is to be able to permit more housing throughout the state. even those comprehensive permits that you see do have conditions on how they are permitted to move forward. And what we have heard consistently, but especially in South Brookline, is that absolute frustration with the construction phase of a larger project or a complicated project. And so back in January, I believe, some town meeting members in South Brookline contacted me, as well as our DPW commissioner and building commissioner, and we started to brainstorm on, different ways, different models that there could be more transparency and primarily more communication between the town, a developer, their subcontractors, and what people are experiencing every day. What Article 14 does is it puts on our books, on the zoning bylaw, it gives the express authority to the Zoning Board of Appeals, who ultimately issues a special permit. It gives them the authority to include conditions on a special permit that are related to the construction phase of a project. So we already include some conditions related to construction mitigation, like having a mitigation plan that's reviewed by different departments. But we thought it would be helpful to put in the zoning bylaw, first of all, make it clear that the ZBA does have such authority. It also kind of puts developers on notice. When they see something in the zoning bylaw, they realize, okay, there's community expectations here. And you'll see in the warrant article language about having signage on the site that says who to call if there's a problem, or where to get more information, or how to look up the plans on which website, to have a hosted web page by the developer that would have construction updates, again, plans, that kind of thing. And that would also have a link to kind of a one-pager from our departments saying, if you see trash concerns, don't guess who you should call. Here's who you should call. We need to make that a lot easier for people to understand who to call when there is a problem, because things happen during construction. But the most important thing we can do is communicate with each other better. Also in Article 14, you'll see as an example, in some cases, we would like to give the ZBA, again, the express authority to be able to condition that a project must hire what's sometimes called a third-party reviewer. And we are actually doing this now with Hancock Village in South Brookline. And this was done without the authority or leverage of a permitting process. It was already permitted. But because the complexity of that project with existing residents living on the property and a variety of things that have happened, both Chestnut Hill Realty and the building commissioner, agreed that what they both needed was a third-party reviewer that Chestnut Hill Realty is paying for, and that group will be on site, kind of dedicated to that site, and will be a helpful communication flow to get information back and forth if there's any enforcement issues, but also, again, just general communication to nearby residents. So that's Article 14 in a nutshell. I will pause and see if there's any questions, Betsy.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I should have said at the very beginning, and I apologize. You can raise your hand to ask a question now, or if you like, you want to put it in the chat, we can certainly read it off for you, but we'll be very, very interested in taking questions, and Kara will pause along the way. So are there any questions at this time? And if so, you can wave your hand in the air, or you can click on the bottom of the screen where there's a raise hand symbol if you want to. But I don't see any waved hands. Oh, wait, here we go. All right, please unmute yourself. There you go.
Yes.
Question, please.
Thank you, Betsy. Good morning, everyone. So I have a question about the consideration of certain components of construction before a permit is granted, such as exposure of radon involved with blasting. Are such specificities enumerated as conditions for permit granting?
I don't know in detail about the demolition concerns, to be perfectly frank. I do know that any blasting permit does require a permit by the fire department, and they are very concerned about a variety of things, including hazardous materials along the way. So we might want to bring in the fire department to answer that specific question about radon and demolition. I'm not sure of those details.
Thank you.
But to follow up a little bit, Kara, you said that the warrant article would require the developer or the agent, the construction agent, to put up some form of public signage that says, here's who you call if you have a question. Because yes. I think it sort of depends on the scale of the project and its proximity to existing housing. But it's very possible from time to time that something occurs, during the middle of the day, and a butter says, oh my goodness, I don't understand this. I'm very worried about it. They need to know who to contact and how to do it.
Exactly. And that's exactly the reason why we thought, it's just silly that we haven't required this as a standard to begin with.
Sure. Well, I think that's a very important part of the warrant article, and definitely I hope it will be fully implemented. Yes, we have a question. Mr. Miller, if you would unmute yourself.
Good morning. I'm Craig Miller, and I'm new to this whole process. I am running for town meeting member for the first time, so this is excellent for me to learn about how the process is working. My question, Kara, is with the signage that you're putting up, is it your intention to have a QR code put on the signs so that anybody walking by can just click on that and then get a whole lot more information than just a list of phone numbers?
Yeah, that's a great idea. We have multiple departments have recently been doing both, typing out the website. Usually we can, the nice thing about a Brookline website is usually you can just do brooklinema.gov and then like a 4-digit number, and that gets you to a specific web page. So it's not very, very long web page. But we've in recent years been doing both, listing the web page as short as possible, as well as the QR code, because that is so much easier just to snag with your iPhone if you've going on a walk. Yes.
Yes, and what I was thinking is that with the QR code, you can have multiple pages of information so that the passerby can see what departments need to be referred to, what specific questions can be answered, and so forth.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what we're trying to move forward with this warrant article. Nice to meet you.
Okay, any other questions for Kara on the parts of Article 14, which I'm going to just propose everybody who may be considering participating in town meeting, if you're an elected member or if you're a candidate and hoping to be, you should really read the warrant article in detail. And I would even highly recommend the explanation from the proponents, the people who put it together, because that's very helpful. And it is a the goal is to simplify and clarify. Is that fair, Kara?
Yeah, what the warrant article does is it gives express authority to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So it makes clear in a legal document that they have the authority to include such conditions. So even if the warrant article doesn't pass, for example, in one of the 40Bs on Bartlett Crescent right now, because of this conversation going on, we are already, as staff from building and planning, including some of these conditions or trying to get it included as a condition with the ZBA. So if warrant Article 14 doesn't pass, it doesn't mean that we couldn't do this anyways, but we think it's still helpful to have this express authority written into the zoning bylaw, so that it's clear to everybody that the ZBA could include such conditions as warranted.
Okay. Are we raising any other questions now? Is any other question? Anybody want to raise your hand? Then I suppose, thank you, Kara, we can move on.
Great. So, and I'll also just,
Donna, you have your hand up again?
Oh, no. Thank you, Kara.
Okay.
And just as a teaser, I do have some slides about the department generally that I'll get to after warrant article 16, which I think will generate a lot of questions and some really fun conversation. So coming soon. So warrant article 16 is even more straightforward, I hope. I think we can go through this one pretty quickly. So right now in our zoning bylaw, and it's been there for decades, what our zoning requires is when you have a building that is built in a commercial business district of local business L or general business G in those business districts, if you're proposing a multifamily building, so a residential project in a commercial district, that's permitted, but our zoning today says, okay, that's permitted, but we want the ground floor to include retail space. That's the intent. The actual wording is non-residential space. So the idea is that in our commercial districts, we don't want to decay kind of that storefront feeling on the ground floor, even if there's residential above. The way the zoning is written and has been written for a long time is it talks about a percentage of the linear length of the front of that building has to be non-residential. So if your building is 100 feet long, which is a pretty big residential building, but if it's 100 feet long, then I think it's at least about half of that frontage has to be non-residential. We have for years been wondering if a developer would ever push that requirement and see what they could get away with by saying, okay, we have the frontage, but guess what, that space, we're gonna just make it 5 feet deep and we're gonna call it an art gallery. And now we can check off the box and we don't have we don't have residential space where we're supposed to. So we'd like to just have this little shallow space to meet that requirement. And we got close to having a real concern with the development that happened on Green Street. This was where Osaka Restaurant was in Coolidge Corner. And the site plans that the developer brought in to begin with, it wasn't quite 5 feet deep, but it was, ranging in like 8 to 11 feet deep of retail space that they were proposing as meeting the requirement. And the planning board and staff and others pushed back hard and said, that doesn't seem like a viable retail space. And so the developer did come back with a plan that shows that a restaurant cafe could actually be built, showing the accessibility widths that would be needed with a counter. And that space got a little bit deeper, I think around 17 feet or something like that. It kind of varies in depth. But that was enough of a case that we thought, okay, let's just put this in the zoning now so we don't have to go through that battle again. And so what this warrant article does is it adds one dimension to our existing bylaw. It says where we need these non-residential spaces, we want to make sure they're at least 15 feet deep. So on the books already is the frontage requirement, and now we're adding and such a space must be at least 15 feet deep. And to give you a sense of that threshold, the businesses that are in the arcade building in Coolidge Corner, if you are inside in the court, in the hallway there of the arcade, those businesses that are internal to the arcade are about 15 feet deep, according to our assessor's data. So that just kind of gives you a feel. It's still a pretty small retail space, but we think viable on the smaller end. And so that's what Article 16 does. It adds an additional requirement when we have multifamily buildings in our commercial districts for the ground floor. And I'll take any questions on that one.
All righty. Any hands up? Donna.
So a situation such as you're describing, which is kind of a hybrid situation. So you have a structure that's both residential and commercial. So I'm wondering what the tax implications are, the the tax impact on the developer to try to fight the commercial requirement so that the tax base is lower because we're dealing with residential property rather than commercial? Is that one of the prevailing reasons why some of the developers are hesitant about including commercial space in their building?
That's a great question. And it is certainly true that our commercial tax base is a higher rate than our residential, and that continues to move forward. From what I've learned and observed, not just in Brookline, but throughout the Boston area and other metropolitan areas similar to Boston, is that most multifamily developments, when you look at their kind of financial statement of how they're making it all work with the construction and then rents or sales of condos, that any kind of retail or ground floor space is basically neutral to their bottom line. The rents that you get over time, or even if you sell it as a commercial condo, what you can get in the market to make that a vibrant space is basically right on the cusp of making it worth even building in the first place. So you'll hear developers talk about how it's basically budget neutral. It's not bringing any additional revenue or helping them get to a place where they can make the project work or not. But what it does do, and they know this, is it provides that kind of soft value of having amenity space basically for the whole neighborhood, but especially for the residents that live there. When someone is looking to live in a commercial district, they're looking, they are obviously prioritizing, living in a walkable place that has different amenities on the ground floor. So from what I've, learned and heard firsthand, I don't think providing a space that's only 5 feet deep or 20 feet deep comes down to the property tax difference. It's more how it affects the bottom line of rents or sales that they could recoup the construction costs.
Thank you.
And if I can just follow up a little bit on what Kara said, because from my experience, and I sat as a select board member and in other roles overseeing some of these things in the town, it is very important that we have multi-use buildings. In our commercial district, it's wonderful to have residential units on the upper floors. It can be commercial, it can be a combination of residential and commercial, but on the street level where you're walking past, you don't want it to be an anonymous blank facade. And that sort of discourages the vitality of the commercial area. So the goal here would be to say, include it could be a modest shop, it could be a floral shop on the ground floor, but make sure it's part of the life of the street, which the people who live above it doesn't really impact them. They can be quietly comfortable and look out and enjoy being in the middle of an area where they have everything close at hand. But it sometimes, and historically, has had conflicting regulations around these things. And this is trying to help bring everything in line so that it works together. Anyway, any other questions for Kara on the substance of Article 16? If I see none, then we will ask her to move on to the really interesting part of this presentation, which is how all these department and divisions and other entities work, and sometimes together.
That's right.
Together, most of the time. Yeah.
So first I'm going to tell you, kind of repeat a little bit of, I guess, what I'd call a stump speech, and then I'll show some slides. But as Betsy said, I've been with the town since 2008, but as Economic Development Director, which is one of 4 divisions in the planning department. And when our previous director retired last October, and I was appointed to this position for the whole department, it was clear that I needed to express where all of our employees felt like we were headed, in this new chapter moving forward. And that is the statement is highly informed by the what we believe are radical forces that we are dealing with right now, due to COVID, due to our emergency climate crisis, as well as the ongoing urgent need that we saw exacerbated during COVID for housing. And so, we think that the department's next chapter, in order to deal with all of these really fast changing things, must include experimentation and innovation in our planning work, in addition to celebrating the day-to-day work that we do just to keep the town running. We're responsible for positively affecting not only the people that live here and work here today, but also those who could be part of the Brookline community in the future. The town's capacity and drive to take local action and leadership, like League of Women Voters, is, we see that action happening to address the region's housing crisis, our nation's systemic racial inequities, and also our global climate emergency. And what makes this community such a rewarding place to work is we are not afraid of even taking on those global issues at a local level and affecting change that then kind of bubbles up to state or regional change. And that's what makes it exciting. Our department strives to advance projects and initiatives that strengthen our physical, social, and economic fabric of our community. And that includes bringing additional resources to the table with commercial development, my older job, in order to support some of these initiatives by expanding that commercial tax base. So, what we're working on right now ranges from bringing forward the idea of life science labs, in some case being permitted in town, additional nonprofit affordable housing, both with Brookline Housing Authority will be coming up on their properties as well as on town properties like the Babcock Street parking lot in Coolidge Corner. We are working on the Boylston Street corridor, as Betsy mentioned, which is now going to be presented in fall of this year. And that's looking at a stretch of Route 9 from Brewton Road to High Street, more or less, looking at that corridor and what kind of some modest changes might be both financially feasible as well as acceptable to the neighborhood nearby. And then we recently were awarded a significant ARPA funding, federal funding that is designated for post-COVID, kind of relief, and where our emphasis with that funding is in recovery projects for our commercial areas, for our small businesses, and making sure that they have that infrastructure to help them continue to survive, help them change their business models to this new kind of post-COVID world, as well as to welcome new businesses with some of our empty storefronts. We have solar panels that are finishing up construction at 5 properties across that are owned by the town, which is wonderful to see that kind of chapter completed. And then we're doing some interesting things with other communities, like our preservation planners are now secured a second phase of grant-funded research from our regional planning agency to work on building deconstruction methods and related policies. And this has to do with, when basically demolition or partial demolition of a building happens, we are interested for a number of reasons in that not just being bulldozed, but rather deconstructed piece by piece, both for sustainability reasons, but also for preservation reasons, because it helps make those decisions more careful. And in other places throughout the country, that building that kind of ecosystem of having deconstruction be a serious part of a construction project. It also adds jobs because those materials can be reused in many cases for other projects that perhaps could use recycled materials rather than brand new materials. And then finally, in the spirit of innovation, we are moving forward with public engagement practices. And we have enjoyed a planner that joined us from Philadelphia, who is a certified community engagement specialist. And it really made a difference in how the planning department is thinking in internal conversations about, especially during COVID with that whole hybrid meeting format, about how we are intentional about the questions we're asking, and also asking ourselves, who is answering these questions already, who's not there to answer the questions, and also, how can we service the whole community rather than those that might show up or might have time to show up to any given meeting. So I'm going to start to share some slides. Okay. And Betsy, can you just confirm you see one slide across the whole screen?
Yeah.
Great. Super.
I think it's working.
Okay, great. So this is an organization chart of our whole department. The boxes that you see in blue are funded by federal funding dollars. So we have 4 divisions. Starting on the right with some of those blue boxes is our community planning division. So that includes our affordable housing office, but it also includes the administrator that handles all of the community development block grant, which is all acronyms, but CDBG funding. And this is federal funding that's passed through the town, not only for housing projects, but also for programs and services ranging from, the senior center to Steps to Success and other, programs like that that are servicing programs that are qualified to spend some of this federal funding. So that's one arm of the office. A piece that I'm going to get into a little bit later is you may not, as a casual observer of town government, hear much from one of our housing planners, David Guzman, but I think it's really important to highlight his work in the division because it is not when new construction is going up or when there's some debate at town meeting, but it's actually about the maintenance of the housing that is affordable and that is restricted by deed. And David, I call him the defender of our affordable housing units. His job is responsible for making sure that those units remain affordable as properties either sell, some properties are condos or homes that over time are sold. And when they're sold, we want to make sure that they're fairly and affirmatively marketed per state and federal rules, as well as being sold to another low or moderate income household. And that's a lot of paperwork and it all happens kind of behind the scenes. But he makes sure that happens, whether it's a rental property or a sale or a property for sale. And then we have this small little division right here, which we'll come back to in a little bit, our sustainability division. And the director is Tom Barrasso. He joined us about a year ago, and he is very experienced person in a variety of sustainability issues. And what I love about Tom is he is working with all of the departments in doing interdepartmental meetings to try to figure out how the town as a whole can move forward together with items that address sustainability and the climate crisis that we're in, especially for things that are most within our control, which is public programs, policies, vehicles, that kind of thing, as well as being supported by the newly reformed Citizen Committee, which is the Zero Energy Advisory Board. And they are pushing forward a variety of policies, both on the for private property as well as the public sector. And then over on the left here is our regulatory planning division. And this group of 6 people, soon to be 7, is set up to be responsive, meaning that, when a special permit comes in or when a property comes in that wants to change something in a local historic district, or when somebody wants to demolish a property. It is received by this group of planners. You'll see here in the yellowish green box, I'm not sure what color that is, in our request for town meeting budget this spring, we do have a request to restore a part-time preservation planner position that was cut during COVID, as well as make that position a whole or 1.0 full-time equivalent to where half of that person's job would be to support the Community Preservation Act, which passed a little bit ago, and we are accruing funding for that. And we could see projects enjoy the use of that funding as soon as fall town meeting. So we want to make sure that we have someone in place to help shuttle and get some ideas of how that funding could best be used, and work with a Community Preservation Act committee. So that's something new that's happening. And then in the middle here is the division that I used to run, the Economic Development and Long-Term Planning Division. And I'm pleased to let everybody know here that Meredith Mooney, who has worked for the town for a while, especially with small business support, has been promoted to the Economic Development Director position. The bad news is we now have 2 empty vacancies within her division. So we are going to be hiring over the next month or so and really working to rebuild that division, especially as we have this ARPA funding I was talking about earlier that we really need to execute to help our small business commercial areas recover from COVID. This is a quick slide from one of the budget presentations, but why do we need to restore that part-time preservation planner position that was cut? During COVID, it might have seemed like there was not a lot of activity at Town Hall, but there was a lot of activity in Brookline. In fact, from fiscal 21 to 23, our preservation applications went up during COVID by more than 1.5 times, even while our staff positions were reduced by 80%. And then, with our affordable units, a quick snapshot, there's a index that the state uses, and it's called the State Housing Inventory. And it's a little bit of a confusing inventory that they keep. It's an idea of, for certain state rules, what percentage of, quote, affordable housing units you have with your total stock. But in fact, the way the state counts those units includes actual deed restricted affordable units that David is protecting, as well as market rate units that might be part of a comprehensive plan project that I was talking about earlier, this 40B project. And to make things more confusing, that state housing inventory units go on that inventory and then come back off when they're in different phases of actually being constructed. And I won't go into the details there. We can answer questions later, but that inventory number has kind of gone up and down a little bit from 2017 to 2022, but you can see the number of residential units that will be, eventually open has increased by, almost 300 in the last 5 years. But the actual, deed restricted affordable units are also increasing in the last years. And that's not only because of the 40B projects, but also because of the way that we've changed our inclusionary zoning bylaw to capture kind of smaller projects to have affordable units, either on site or cash payment. So we've permitted and created more than 76 affordable units. We've created an Olmsted-Richardson local historic district, which is a huge lift, in which we're celebrating this year as well, with all kinds of things related to Olmsted. We have piloted racial equity goals in our decision-making process for the second round. We had 2 rounds of a small business relief grant program that was funded by earlier federal dollars before the ARPA funding has come through. And what that means is we actually, in our rubric of scoring different applications, took the race-based or women-owned factor into account when deciding how to disperse those funds. So that was a first for us with the town council's office in hand, moving step by step to experiment with how we could do that legally. And then in partnership with Public Works and our building department, we were a regional lead in transitioning COVID era outdoor dining seating. We got some rules that helped restaurants permanently done last fall. And we're seeing now a lot of communities asking us how we did that and kind of scrambling this spring. Our businesses are obviously COVID may be waning a little bit, but it's going to take them, 5 to 10 years to recover the business impacts that they had during COVID. And they know that especially in places like Brookline, it's going to make sense for more flexibility of outdoor dining to be in place in the years to come, just with viruses or other sicknesses that we do transmit to each other when we're inside. And we are seeing a shift of consumer preference for outdoor dining whenever feasible. We've completed some rooftop solar projects, which I talked about earlier. We also, for the first time, thanks to Tom Barrasso, included sustainability scoring in the internal review that the town does for capital improvement projects. So this is also a first, making sure that the decision-making process includes a kind of pause and thinking about which of these projects are moving us towards fossil fuel-free municipality as a whole when we're looking at infrastructure projects that we're funding for the public. And then finally, during COVID, a new hotel opened at 700 Brookline Avenue, and that's right between Brookline Avenue and River Road on Route 9 at the Boston border. So our affordable units are increasing, even though the federal funding, those blue squares I was showing you, the federal funding that we're receiving to support those staff remains flat. But the work that they're doing is 4 to 5 times the number of cases, because again, we're working with smaller and smaller projects now. So the number of cases has gone up 4 to 5 times, depending on how we look at it. And the other types of affordable unit cases are going up 3 times. So we anticipate to see this kind of inclusionary zoning requirement, which is wonderful. It's capturing smaller projects, mid-sized projects, which is great, but we're going to have to start thinking about what that means, because the kind of transaction cost is getting higher and higher for the town as those positions are, flat funded from federal funding. So I'm going to go a little bit faster through this slide, but for the first
stop you just for Kara. I just want to stop you, and because there's a lot of content here, and I'm thinking if there are any questions. I have 2 in the chat.
Oh, great! Yes, go ahead.
Pause for a moment. I want to give you those 2, and then we can go on. But if there's anyone else who wants to speak, at the bottom of the screen there's a raise hand symbol, or you can just wave your hand, or you can put a question in the chat, because I know there's a lot of content here and it's pretty compressed. But anyway, first question. What is the relationship between the planning department, I think it says the department, and the move to create a comprehensive plan?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a minute. So I will answer that question in a couple of slides.
All right, then we'll go there. And then the second question is, can you explain what community preservation funds are?
Yes, that is a great question. So the CPA, Community Preservation Act, was voted by the town electorate a couple of years ago now. And what it does is it levies both a local fee as well as usually matched by state funding that comes whenever, for example, you do something at the Registry of Deeds. There's a fee, whether or not you're in a community that's voted the CPA Act, there's a fee that happens there. So those 2 funding sources are combined and come back to the town, and we are estimating that those numbers are going to be, I think, just above $1 million. I'll have to pull that up in a second, but significant funding that can be used for projects of certain types, so that projects that you're allowed to use CPA funding on is housing projects, preservation projects, and then also open space projects. So those are kind of the three buckets where we could use that funding. The CPA committee will process those applications, ask questions, hopefully refine it so that it meets all of the rules that come along with that funding source. But then those final decisions of where that, of how that funding is spent will have to be adopted by town meeting, just as they do our whole budget.
And I'm just going to add a quick footnote to something that you mentioned earlier about the count of affordable housing units that includes specifically projects done under the state legislation called 40B. In a 40B project, 20 to 25%, and typically it's 20% of the units are actually affordable, but 100% of the units that are constructed under that form are counted. And so when you look at the total list, which I used to do on a regular basis, and I was quite annoyed at the results, it seems to me that 50% at least, and sometimes as high as 70 of the total number that are counted were not affordable. They were part of a project that included a combination of affordable and non-affordable units, but the non-affordable units got counted because they were under 40B. So be careful if you try to find that statistic, it's possibly misleading. Anyway, I apologize for that. Carry on.
Okay, and yeah, and this slide I think helps demonstrate that, right? Like, so the state at the end of 2022 was talking about how we had 2,600 units on the way they count, as Betsy was talking about. But in fact, the actual number of affordable units was just under 2,200. So, 400 unit gap. Absolutely.
Exactly. Anyway, so carry on.
So, I will move a little bit faster in the next couple of slides, but I think it's important to say that when I came on board as a director, we, for the first time in anybody's memory of, decades at least, actually had reviews of staff within the department. And the way we did that is to make sure that they were two-way staff reviews. We work in the public sector. It is extremely hard to fire anybody, and it is extremely hard to promote anybody or give someone, a bonus, right? We are very, very kind of set with the way public organizations work. That doesn't mean that we can't improve the services that we provide to the public and also take care of our employees. And so what these reviews did is we were asking people to, tell their manager, what is it that you need in order to support your individual work better, for the public. And those conversations also sparked new ideas and potential directions that the department's going to be moving into. And that includes some of our community engagement commitments, kind of formalizing how we do that, both in kind of review projects and also kind of larger, more master plan projects. It includes racial equity plan, which we have to work on in tandem with our board and commission volunteers to make sure that that is something that's pragmatic and also effective. And in general, what we hear is from our own staff is, as we move forward in figuring out what our multi-year plan will be, a crucial thing we're going to be asking is, who is using our services? Who needs the services that maybe are not coming to us or don't know that they can access our services? And who is paying for which kinds of services, and who benefits from our time and funding spent? And that kind of gets to the racial equity lens as well. So, for example, who benefits from affordable housing? One of the employee I was highlighting earlier, David Guzman, because of work that he did, actually just yesterday got a housing award on behalf of the town of Brookline from CHAPA, which is an affordable housing advocacy group in Massachusetts, highly regarded. And the award that the town of Brookline was given was based on the fact that a couple years ago now, we changed what's called a local preference. So in many Massachusetts communities, when you have an affordable unit that comes up, there is a legal statement that's on the books that says, okay, of all the applicants that come in, we're going to give preference to those people who are already Brookline residents, Brookline employees, or have children that are in the Brookline school system. And this seems, you know, on the face of it, like a good policy, right? If you're having an affordable unit in Brookline, it should help Brookline people first. You know, that's where that kind of lands. But as we are looking more critically at things from a race-based perspective, what was really eye-awakening, you know, just really interesting, is thinking about how that kind of location-based preference might in fact be furthering racial disparities rather than helping close that gap. And so what David did is he went back and looked at some actual projects, and I just thought this data was so interesting. So 420 Harvard Street, of the affordable units that were, you know, again, actual affordable units that were constructed, when the lottery went out, which means kind of the call for anybody to show, do all the paperwork to show that their income qualified for some of the units. When those came in, there's two rows here. Here's all of the applicants in this kind of middle row based on race, as well as the applicants that would have been considered local preference. And what we see here is that white applicants, because of the local preference, would have benefited, sorry, let me get this straight, would have benefited because even though they represented, let's take just white, not Hispanic, they represented 26% of, you know, all the applicants that came in. But if we had the local preference lens only, it would have represented a higher 31% of the applicants. Whereas our Black or Hispanic or Black non-Hispanic applicants, there was a small variation in that case, but I'm going to show you another example. Our Asian applicants, for example, because Brookline's minorities do tend to have higher Asian than other minorities, the local preference actually would have helped more representation of Asian households using the local preference. At Olmsted Fisher Hill, what we saw there is, for example, our Black African-American applicants represented 10% of all the applications that came in, but with that local preference would have only represented 3% of the total applications. Whereas our white applications, you know, again, out of all of the applicants was 31%, but with that local preference would have been 27%. And then 373-84 Harvard, this one we thought was very interesting, with a white non-Hispanic ethnicity was 56% of all the applications that came in, but within the local preference was a much higher representation of 67%, whereas our Black, Hispanic, or not Hispanic, you know, that was almost 14% of all the applicants. But when you use that local preference filter, it would have only been 3.5% of all of our applications. And so what's interesting is about 2 years ago, we changed that local preference so that instead of 75% of the affordable units going to local preference, the rules are now that 25% of the units go to local preference applicants. So that shift was actually made a couple of years ago, but this data of, you know, applicants' race coming in, looking back, shows how by lowering that local preference, we are actually seeing a higher rate of diverse applicants that actually end up with those units. That's the point of all, of all that data. So as we look ahead moving forward, we absolutely need to prioritize our employees' welfare, our own employees. It's 98% of our budget is our staff. We need to protect our resources that we have. Moving to hybrid models for staff and public meetings is wonderful, and it also means a lot of changing technology that we will need to lean on our boards and committee members to help us implement so that we are more transparent and available to the public in general. The work is going to change drastically with the racial equity lens as well as community engagement. And what those two things mean, in short, is that every staff-supported public meeting is going to become much more expensive, likely less frequent, and therefore they must be more useful to everyone. So we're really going to be kind of thinking about ways to dramatically shift the way we use our public resources. We also have to identify different funding sources. So for example, with our affordable housing projects, having those higher inclusionary zoning payments through recent years of changing that number is going to be helpful there. And then finally, this is a teaser for probably next fiscal year, but if we are in a climate change emergency, that is certainly not being reflected by funding one person for the whole town to deal with climate change. We will be asking for that division to be built out over the years as funding is available, but it's also likely going to need to be staffed from a variety of departments internally in the future. We have some planning study priorities that are underway, ranging from the Kent Street project, the local rapid recovery plan, which is using some ARPA funding for some really exciting projects, both programmatically as well as physical projects in Coolidge Corner and JFK Crossing, including pop-up business events, getting a business improvement district off the ground, which we have a board of property owners that are now moving that forward finally, which is really exciting and important for recovery of COVID. The Boylston Street corridor, which is now being pushed to the fall. We have site plan review that we want to get on the books, and that's primarily in partnership with working with Department of Public Works. And that would be kind of formalizing a staff review for projects, whether or not they are major impact projects, rather than relying on the board structure to do that cross-department review. We have this spring a warrant article about electric vehicle charging requirements. We're wrapping up our housing production plan, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about that. This is probably the most important thing that our department is working on right now, which is a guide for how, if we recognize that we are part of a region that needs housing, how, where, and to what extent does Brookline want to be a part of solving that need. And then there's a committee that's already in place looking at 10 Brookline Place, which is the building that's on the northeast corner of Route 9 as Washington Street wraps around to Brookline Village. Some people may know it as the Jimmy Fund building, or where the Art Institute used to be, or if you go back far enough, where the Colorado Public Library used to be. There's a committee looking at that property, considering lab use as a redevelopment of that property. We've got community aggregation, so our electricity bills, every single one of you, we have community aggregation pricing that helps electricity prices be lower for the most part, although we cannot guarantee that. It has since the last 6 years or so that this program has been in place. It's kind of a group buying on behalf of our residents, and also means that we can offer products that are include more renewable energy than mandated by the state. So that's coming up right now. Actually, we're talking to bidders and our broker about that contract coming up in December. I hinted about this regional deconstruction study that's going on in the second phase. The Community Preservation Act will be ramping up this summer. And then our sustainability director is working with other departments on implementing a net zero study, primarily for public programs and infrastructure that'll be going on this summer. There is a new state law. So just when we thought we were done with 40Bs, there's a new state law that is now going to be effective as soon as this fall. And it's called the MBTA Community Action Plan is one of the things that we'll need to get done. And I know we don't have time to get into that today, but in short, this new state law requires Brookline to have zoning districts where you can build multifamily units by right, meaning no special permit process, no 6 to 9 month process with the Zoning Board of Appeals. So that's going to be a really important discussion, and frankly, why it would be so helpful to have all of you now participate as much as you can in the next really just couple of weeks to tell us where you think housing makes sense, what kind of housing makes sense, and in what ways. And you can do that through our housing production plan process that's wrapping up. This public phase is wrapping up in the month of May. We know that our select board members want to move forward with looking at a Babcock Street parking lot for affordable housing to reuse that property. We have on our books now to look at Chestnut Hill Village, which is Route 9, closest to Newton. We have a commitment to the voters for looking at how we will use the Newberry parcel. This is a property that we acquired as part of a development after the Newberry College closed. And now we need to figure out, how that parcel is going to be used in the long run. And then we do have a strategic asset plan, a major parcel study that is on our shelf, and many of those recommendations in there could be implemented now that we have the Community Preservation Act funding as a potential. We are very much interested and want to support those that want to have an update of our comprehensive plan. As a side note, the League of Women Voters, according to Janice Kahn, and I'm sure that this is true, the League of Women Voters is actually the group that got the last comprehensive plan reboot off the ground. And I believe that you all did that through a grant that you got as kind of a shortened, I think it was like a weekend charrette or something like that. And by providing that kind of grassroots interest and demonstrating that the community was ready to look at such a big question like a comprehensive plan, according to Janice, but it also appears from the public record that your activism is what got the attention and resources pulled together for the town then to update the comprehensive plan when they last did, which was more than 15 years ago. So I don't know what happened with the advisory committee vote last night, but it could be that we have additional staff to get kind of a scoping of what the comprehensive plan would look like. And this would be primarily working with a lot of the committees that we have in order to figure out, what is the scope of updating a comprehensive plan? Why are we updating a comprehensive plan? And to make sure that people have shared goals so that when it's completed, it doesn't just sit on a shelf. We are not going to be doing these other things here that are in the cut category, which I'll just skip through for now, except to say, let me highlight the tree bylaw. So we worked this winter with DPW staff on drafting a tree canopy general bylaw, which we are really excited about, but that has been put on hold by DPW until they can get additional funding for basic equipment that they're asking for, as well as staff. So that is something that if DPW can secure more funding, we could then enact a tree bylaw. So these are some of the same projects that I was talking about before. This slide's a little bit more recent, but basically as funding and interest builds, I do see a comprehensive plan update in our future. And I will end there. Those are, I know that was a lot of
Think
information.
about. I have one question that I would like to ask, but I also have one in the chat, which I think may be something that other people would be interested in. Is there a link to the existing comprehensive plan, which is like 15 years old? Is that right, Kara? I seem to be around during that time, so.
Yeah, I'll pop that in the link here. Great.
Okay, that's great. And then just an example of the kinds of things that do come up, and again, kind of drawing on my own experience, there was a goal of having affordable senior housing access with good access to public transit built on the town-owned Kent Street parking lot, which is right across the street from the Brookline Village T-Stop. I believe that process is in its maybe 4th or 5th year and got stuck. I'm not quite sure exactly how or why, but I was part of the original planning group. But having said that, I noticed that the Babcock Street parking lot is coming up, which is another town-owned parking lot. It's in Coolidge Corner. And one of the barriers to Kent Street, and I assume will also be at Babcock, had to do with preserving the existing parking, literally, because at least in the case of both of them, there were people who depended on it for off-street parking. So I'm illustrating an example of the kinds of things that you did not anticipate when you started a project becoming a barrier. And I'm not saying, Kara, that I know you have or have not been able to solve those, but it's an example of the sorts of things that the planning process has to deal with.
That's right. Yep.
Any other questions? You want to raise your hand and chime in?
Comprehensive plan, but that is different than a housing production plan, correct? Because it's more comprehensive.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this is you know this is where your brain starts to hurt. But for example, when the housing production plan is complete, and especially if the reboot of the comp plan as a whole happens very soon, it is likely that we could almost take that housing production plan and it serve as a chapter of the comprehensive plan. So it certainly provides a lot of information that could almost be lifted word for word and incorporated and wrapped into a comp plan. Other examples that I'll give you for other state funding reasons, our parks and open space division is required to update a parks and open space plan, every couple years. And the reason they do it is for funding purposes. It's an actual requirement in order to access some funding. Those plans, every time they come out, talk about, we need 6 more baseball fields and 8 squash courts or whatever, but nothing has been built. Like no action happens after that, right? So something that I think is really important for the community to understand is kind of that elevator speech of, before we sink $1 million and 3 years of everybody's time, let's all be crystal clear on what we're going to get out of, action items out of doing such a large comprehensive plan, because none of us want to spend that kind of time and resources on a plan that would just, basically gather dust. We need to make sure that those who are actually authorized to move the town forward, including the select board and planning board primarily, but also other boards, of course, we need to make sure that they think and understand why a comprehensive plan would help them move forward the town in a way that is supported by the whole community.
And just another sort of detail level on this whole question of planning and trying to think long-term and in the best interests of everybody. There's also just a reality check on that, which says that sometimes we enter into a plan and then something happens, intervenes from the outside, and in a funny sort of way, there's a warrant article before this coming town meeting that would, its goal is to create recreation programs for low-income people with no cost, for which there is no budget currently. And to the extent that it means that in considering financial impacts, you can have a wonderful comprehensive plan and you can have a wonderful plan for parks and open space, but it comes down to if this were to become town practice, and I mean practice as opposed to policy, to offer all rec programs to low-income kids at no cost to them or at very modest cost, then there's a trade-off in the budget between capital improvements and operating expense. And it's a modest little example of how we go into a process where we try hard to think things through and get everything right. And then some other agenda maybe, and I'm not saying this is an agenda, it's not fair, it sounds a little prejudiced, but what I am saying, another goal or objective creates an obstacle. And so things do not move quite as smoothly as we had wished. And I'm not trying to be critical about anything, I'm just pointing out what what sometimes reality means. On the other hand, I personally have to say to Kara that I am totally impressed and delighted to see all of the effort that you and your staff have put into this planning process, that how you're thinking things out in reasonable, how should I put it, components that may become achievable. I know that there's some things like the housing production plan in process that one hopes will actually be done and then feed into the comprehensive plan process. So all of those are constructive activities and steps. And anyway, I really appreciate all of that. And I'm now going to shut up and ask if there's any other comment from anybody who would like to speak.
Kara, I am impressed with the quality of the staff that provides services to Brookline, and especially of the department that you are leading. All professionals and all contributing very well to the services or the quality of life here in Brookline. I'm wondering, many of us have been affected by construction around town. Mostly we take one family house, and on a lot that is a little bit too large, and there's space behind it, so we can put up another building without any trouble. And sometimes are taking down the building that's there and building a, multi-unit structure, that's there. And you've seen this a lot, and all of us have as well. I'm wondering, I know that the preservation department is one of the things that's under your guise there of trying to maybe stem the tide of that. Other than watching the meetings of the Preservation Commission and Planning and Zoning Board, what else can we do as citizens if we have concerns about these projects that are underway?
Yeah, thank you, Ernie. I have three or four things come to mind, but I think it's going to be a little bit of a speaking freely here, but in brainstorming mode, and I will let's all understand now that we are in a brainstorming box, and I am not declaring anything particularly. I believe that the neighborhoods that are seeing those impacts could very quickly get to some zoning changes that would basically downzoning properties is what we're talking about, to be very specific, making the allowable floor area ratio less, strengthening the status of setbacks, for example, perhaps not allowing them to be as squishy as they are by getting relief through a special permit. These are things that are discrete and I think would be a really interesting and practical and useful time of resources and board members spent. Our planning board is just as frustrated, I know. Our preservation commission certainly is. I think there's a lot of alignment in actually getting something done that will be completely sidetracked if we then launch into a comprehensive plan study right now. I think that the state, we know that the state will continue to provide carrots and sticks for the town to provide housing generally as, a regional strategy. So I think if we have a strong housing production plan where we say, this is where we want housing and how we want it, for example, not tearing down a 2-family in order to build luxury 2-family, like that's not supporting anybody's housing goals, right? I think there's a piece here that would be supported by all the groups in town that we could enact pretty quickly and roll up our sleeves and get done, but that would be sidelined if we instead launched into comprehensive planning efforts at this time. I also am interested in that more surgical look at things, because no matter what the state does, no matter what zoning changes are made or anything else, we all know here, I believe, that the market pressure to build luxury housing condos is going to continue to be with us. And so we are going to, if we do nothing, our community will still change, right? And so we have to all pitch in together and say, first of all, recognize the region is growing and we need to be a part of that region, but then direct where we want that growth to happen and also protect the building form that makes our neighborhoods so precious. I mean, we have people from all over the country that can't believe some of the tree-lined streets that we still have today. And the building structures themselves that have such a cohesiveness are being drip by drip taken away and destroyed.
Wow. There's actually, I hate to say this, but recently being publicized an example on Aspinwall Avenue in the area of Brookline Village, where a neighborhood which is of, I think, single and 2-family homes basically, but has a historic background, had a building torn down and a very large thing that sort of takes up the facade. The facade of it is right on the sidewalk, is totally out of character with anything that was there before. And I think the local folks have been in shock and horror at what happened. I guess what I'm doing is saying illustrative example. Maybe there's a way to reach out to neighborhood groups and try to help people get a better understanding of what tools are available to them, which some people feel, for example, they don't want to be in a historic district because they find it too restrictive. But is there some other thing in between that, which could be a matter of zoning, that would provide the kind of, I guess I'm maybe the wrong word here is, but would limit what can happen, that would be so out of character that people would be a little startled by what happened.
Yeah, and I think I see another hand up too, but I'll respond by saying, I think a productive way of having that conversation is going back to thinking about, racial equity lens, right? Who is benefiting from the current construction practices, and how do we want it to benefit different people in the future? And of course, part of that conversation is how it impacts the existing residents in the neighborhood. But if we go through this through an equity lens, we'll likely get to the same endpoint where tearing down smaller units to build very expensive larger units probably isn't furthering any equity goals either.
Okay, and now I'm going to defer to your hand speaker, but just for the record, and I think Carolyn, you're the one who asked this question, the link to the comprehensive plan is in the chat. So if you want it, you can click on it and see what the current comprehensive plan says.
First of all, thank you so much, Cara. I'm so glad I came today. Learned so much, and there's a lot of conversation with the upcoming elections around these issues and everything. So this is really helpful. And I have just had you talk about kind of the key kind of discrete zoning laws that could make a difference. How are zoning laws changed? Are they done by the town meeting, or are they, I mean, I should probably know this, but I don't. Like, what would be the process if, say, Ernie and I wanted to get together and,
Yes.
at an event and think about, because I live in an area where there's a lot of kind of tear downs and luxury condos being built, so.
Yeah, so any 10 citizens can bring a warrant article to town meeting. Zoning has historically required 2/3 vote by town meeting. It is also important, although not always required, to have the planning board endorse a zoning article. That's not something that has to happen, but it's a really important step. They are required to have a public hearing and give any recommendation that they have to town meeting, but town meeting doesn't have to follow that recommendation. So that, yeah, any 10 residents can do that. And a very interesting thing, I'm going to throw out another sparkler while we're brainstorming today, is the Housing Act that was passed a couple years ago, which some in town are afraid of, because that bylaw says that, that state rule says that voting threshold for zoning changes goes from 2/3 down to a simple majority, but only for zoning changes that show that they're increasing housing unit capacity. I believe there is a solution that you all are dealing with, Carolyn, in your neighborhood, and that Ernie's been talking about, that addresses the concerns that current residents have, but that also could increase the number of actual housing units, perhaps within the same structure, right?
And just for the record, around Brookline, there are multiple multi-unit neighborhoods that people enjoy. They're walkable, they're attractive, and they too, in addition to the example I gave, which was single family being replaced by multi-units, the neighborhoods with multi-units are under similar pressure. I think that's what Carolyn and Ernie are talking about. Why don't we have more density, right? If we have 100 units, we could have 500 units. And probably all driven by, how should I put it, economic interests. And not affordable housing, that's probably for sure. Anyway.
So to wrap up, I guess more formally with Ernie and Carolyn's question, ways to use your time well would include, I'm going to pitch again, please participate in the housing production plan. There is a kit that's online that you can do with your own neighborhood association, or we could even have a staff person come and facilitate that if you want, but having that kind of feedback with the housing production plan will set seeds for future policy. And then this fall, when the final guidelines come out related to this MBTA Community Act requirement that we allow multifamily units, that will open up another public discussion of, if the state is now saying you must have a way to allow, not necessarily build, but allow multifamily units, where and how do we want to see that happen? I think that could be another opportunity to weave in the concerns. But I would also encourage you guys to get together, and we could, as we have staff time, but I think depending on what happens with this comprehensive plan timing, if we're not launching a comprehensive plan in the next 9 months, if funding isn't found, for example, to launch that in a serious way in the next 9 months, then we could have space to do this more kind of surgical zoning conversation and support a citizen initiative.
Well, I think it's just about 11 o'clock and time for us to let everybody go, but I thank you so much, Kara. This has been excellent. It's very, very educational and informative. We much appreciate it and hope that this is something that we can share with a wider audience, because the whole thing has been recorded. And once we get through the technical matters, it will get posted through the Brookline and BIG. I never get the words right, but it will be available online. So we hope that other people will have access and will be able to get the same benefits that we all have today. So thank you very much, Kara. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank
And
you.
we hope to see you on another Friday morning. Take care.
Bye.